Hello, and welcome to episode 34 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with former Maryland State Senator Larry Levitan. How are you doing today, Larry?
Doing fine. Beautiful day, and everybody's uptight because of the election.
So, well, let's get started. So let me ask you the first question, which is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I served in the Maryland legislature for 24 years, 4 of them in the House of Delegates and 20 in the State Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And for 16 of those 20 years, I was chairman of the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee, which is probably the key committee in the legislature, because not only does it work on the budget, but it works also on tax legislation, tax bills, and on the House side, they have 2 committees doing that. One does the tax side, the other does the budget.
So why is the budget and why are taxes important? Why does that advance the public interest? How does that play into the role of the legislature?
Well, in Maryland, it's the only state in the country where the governor's budget can only be cut by the legislature. The legislature cannot add anything to the budget.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only state where that happens. So that limits the power of the legislature. On the capital side, though, on the capital budget, the legislature does have the ability to increase capital spending.
For our listeners, the difference between an operational budget and a capital budget is that a capital budget refers to construction of physical things. An operational budget can be for programs and enforcement of general laws.
Correct. That's exactly it. But the key is Maryland has to have a balanced budget, and sometimes you need new revenue. For instance, when it came to the gas tax, the state's highway money was falling dramatically because they couldn't repair roads or build bridges or repair bridges, because for 20 years the legislature and the governor had never addressed the issue.
Right.
Finally, they came in and they did increase the gas tax, which I think was very important and should have been done a while before that.
So if they increase a tax and bring in more revenue than the governor had anticipated in his budget, what happens to that revenue since they can't add to the budget?
Well, the governor comes in with it the following year, or the governor could come in with a supplemental budget, which they do all the time, to pick up the money. He amends his budget throughout the year, throughout the 90-day session, and even the very last day he can come in with a supplemental.
So really, in effect, though constitutionally the legislature is effectively hamstrung, they can't formally add to the governor's budget. They can request that the governor add to his own budget.
They can. Sometimes the governor may do it, other times he may not. But the other sort of tricky thing that happens is because the governor is mandated to put in certain funds, depending on the legislation that was passed, he comes in with a Budget Reconciliation Act and reduces in this bill items that the legislature had mandated, and so that gives him some additional authority.
But that bill can only be introduced by a legislator, by request of the administration, correct?
It's put in by the governor, because the legislature is not going to put in a bill to reduce its own mandates.
But I thought that only a delegate could introduce a bill in the House of Delegates and a senator could introduce a bill in the Senate.
No, the governor. There are administration bills that the Speaker and the President put in for the governor.
Right, so it's the Speaker.
I don't think that they've ever turned down, maybe once, a request by the governor to put a bill in.
So the Speaker, listeners, who is the elected leader of the House of Delegates, elected by his colleagues, and the Senate President, being similarly the leader of the Senate, are actually state senators and state delegates, but they can introduce legislation by request of the administration, which is to say they act on behalf of the governor at his request.
That's true. And it's interesting in Maryland because both the Speaker and the President are long-serving members of the legislature. For example, Mike Miller came into the legislature with me in the House of Delegates in 1971. I went out in 1995, and Mike Miller's still there and has been President of the Senate since the 80s.
And
so
he is the
long-serving, probably he's the longest-serving Senate President in the country.
Ever.
Yeah, ever.
So, well, let's bring it back a little bit. So what district did you represent while you were in the House and in the Senate?
I represented the western part of Montgomery County, which is Potomac and North Potomac,
right,
and goes up to Damascus and the whole western part of the county to Poolesville and Barnesville. It was the largest land mass in Montgomery County. And it's of all the districts in Montgomery County, it was the one that was more evenly divided, Republicans and Democrats. And in 1995, when I lost an election, I lost it to a Republican. That was a year where Newt Gingrich ran with his contract with America, and that one district in Montgomery County, the only one, elected, I think, 3 Republicans, 1 state senator and 2 delegates.
So listeners, just for your information, in Maryland, so there are 51 constitutions in the United States, 1 for each state plus the federal. Each constitution is different in each state, and each legislature is composed of a different amount of legislators for different terms and different sessions, which is when they make laws. What Senator Levitan just mentioned is that in Maryland, many districts have 3 delegates and 1 senator for the same exact population, the exact same district, which is unusual compared to other states around the country. So what he's saying is 3 delegates, the top 3 won in that race, 2 are Republican, and then the Senate, there's only 1 senator and a Republican won in that race in 1995.
And so it's changed back again. There is not 1 elected Republican representing Montgomery County in any capacity at this point in time. So,
well, Governor Hogan represents Montgomery County.
I'm talking about in Montgomery County.
Yeah.
Who lives in Montgomery County.
Right.
So, I agree with that.
So what is unique about your district? Why were you representing that district? What was unique in particular to the district you were representing that in what the issues and that you were trying to advocate for in the legislature?
Well, I think in Montgomery County is a very liberal county. And the area that I represent, Potomac primarily, is they're heavily Republican, very wealthy, probably one of the wealthiest areas, subdivisions in the country. And so you find an electorate that basically was conservative.
So you were a Democrat.
I was a Democrat.
So you were representing both one of the most liberal areas and quite one of the most wealthy areas, which correlated with some level of conservatism.
That area is not. I wouldn't say is the most liberal area. It was more conservative.
So how did you reconcile the differences along the political spectrum within your constituency?
Well, actually, I fit into that mold.
Okay.
I'm a moderate. And I always believe that if you want the legislature to work, it's got to work in the middle. You've got to understand that certain people have views one way, certain people have views the other way. The other person's entitled to their view as well. And somehow you got to get to the middle. When I served as chairman of the Budget Committee, the legislature, you had Republicans that would come to the middle and vote with Democrats, and vice versa. So that you're able to function. As time went on, you have the legislature today. You have those on the Democrats on the very liberal side, the left side, and Republicans go further to the right. It happens in Congress as well, and it's tough to get things done. I mean, Congress has been a disaster.
So, first of all, how do you define a moderate?
Well, I think you define a moderate as somebody who basically has a business understanding of business and the importance of business,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to some others that maybe really rely too much on the labor side,
Mm-hmm.
or when you get to issues, very controversial issues of pro-life and right to life,
Mm-hmm.
and death penalty versus non-death penalty,
Mm-hmm.
and things of that type. Basically, when you get to the abortion issue, I don't think there is a way to get to the middle. People have their views, and they'll stick to them, so somehow you get hopefully the Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, will stay.
So it sounds like maybe it's more difficult to be moderate on moral issues, but it's more easy to be moderate on fiscal issues?
I think that's probably true. That's true.
How did you determine where you stood on certain issues?
I guess it's the way you're brought up and your background. And I was an accounting major in undergraduate school and went to law school at GW, undergraduate school at Washington and Lee University. And I think it's the way you're brought up, I think, has a lot to do with your leanings on how you feel, and maybe your the guidance from your parents, etc.
Mm-hmm.
On liberal, moderate, I'm not sure how. It's your brain, tell you the truth.
So
Gets you there.
to what extent did the views of your constituency shape your views?
Well, I always felt that I was elected to do what I thought was right. Now, I don't think you normally have to follow, and maybe the views of your constituents,
Mm-hmm.
if in fact you feel that that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I was willing always to take the risk if I thought it was right. Now, give you an example, perfect example. I was chairman of the Senate Budget and Tax Committee when the issue of building a new stadium in Baltimore for the baseball team.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a popular issue in Montgomery County.
Mm-hmm.
Montgomery County didn't want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, a few $100 million to build a stadium for Edward Bender Williams and the Orioles. When the vote came to my committee
Mm-hmm.
on the issue, the vote was 6-6. I had to break the tie, and I felt personally, even though my constituents probably felt otherwise, that the Baltimore Orioles was important for the state of Maryland and for Baltimore, and that if we didn't fund the stadium, the team would leave, because Edward Bender Williams was ill at the time, and when he died, the team would be sold. So I voted for the stadium, and that was, again, something I thought was important, but my constituents did not.
Were there repercussions for you politically?
Well, I did lose an election.
So you
well,
voted.
I don't think that. I mean, the problem is when you're chairman of a committee,
Mm-hmm.
you have to do things that's important for the state, to make sure the state, all of those things aren't popular, say, in Montgomery County and in my legislative district.
Mm-hmm.
And that was used against me, certainly, when I lost in 95. But it was time. I mean, 24 years in the legislature is a long time.
So while you were there, was the Senate President Steny Hoyer?
Steny Hoyer was the president. No, he was the president when I became chairman of the committee. Jim Clark became president. Steny Hoyer ran for lieutenant governor and lost. And this was the period before he took Gladys Spellman's seat in Congress. So Jim Clark. What happened was Jim Clark from Howard County was part of Montgomery County delegation.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of Howard County was included. And he was elected president, and then Montgomery County legislators were
Mm-hmm.
able to select
Mm-hmm.
who should be chairman of the Budget and Tax Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, I was sitting on that committee. And
Well, the reason I ask about Steny Hoyer, who is now the second in Democratic leadership in the U.S. House of Representatives, and then also, while you were there, Ben Cardin was the Speaker of the House.
correct,
And Mike Miller was the President of the Senate while you were in the legislature.
for 8 years.
So the reason, and obviously now for our listeners, Ben Cardin is now one of two U.S. senators for the state of Maryland. So I asked this question to say, to what extent are the relationships that you built with those legislators, to what extent did they carry over into the federal legislature, and how did that impact your relationship, I guess, with Congress? And because obviously there are multiple levels of government, and they ought to coordinate in order to advance the public interest. So how did you leverage the relationships you built in Annapolis once those individual politicians moved to the Congress?
Well, very close. I have a very close relationship with Ben Cardin.
Mm-hmm.
When I was chairman of the Budget Committee and he was Speaker of the House,
Mm-hmm.
I felt it was important for the House and Senate to work together.
Mm-hmm.
And I set up a situation where jointly we would meet on a regular basis and work together. And Ben went to Congress, and we've remained close. And
Mm-hmm.
where I have issues even today,
Mm-hmm.
where people need help, I will call Ben, and he'll return my call. But he's very bright.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his whole life has been politics, and he's been very successful. And he's also good at being able to work with the Republicans in the Senate
Mm-hmm.
to get legislation through, which, again, because of the deadlock that they have, is important.
Mm-hmm.
But the relationships are good. I also have a strong relationship with Steny Hoyer, so it's a good work. It's good. It's good.
Do you have an example of coordinating between state and federal legislation? For instance, potentially, there's many federal agencies in Montgomery County and in Prince George's County, like the National Institutes of Health, the Federal Drug Administration, there's the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. There's a lot of federal money going in here. A lot of your district was composed of constituents who are largely employed by the federal government. So do you have an example of how you worked with your former colleagues to advance the interests of your constituents at a different level of government to which you were not elected?
Actually, I had enough on my plate to deal with Maryland.
Yeah.
We would, and the governor does, through regular meetings with members of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
But directly, other than maybe trying to help a constituent or two
Mm-hmm.
with an issue they may have in the health area
Mm-hmm.
but as a general rule, you didn't work. We just dealt with the state, not so much with Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we pushed to get new highway money or
Mm-hmm.
other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't that close a relationship where, again, we're worried about how to deal with Maryland and Maryland's problems and not so much the national issues.
And then you've remained involved in public service, or at least in political and legislative affairs, since you left the Senate. What have you been doing, and why have you been doing it?
Well, one of the things that I did when I lost in
Mm-hmm.
'95, and I expected I was going to win, but I didn't,
Mm-hmm.
and understood, is I started lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you got to remember, there's not a real learning curve between legislating and lobbying.
Mm-hmm.
You're still pushing for issues. One you're being a legislator and being paid by the state, the other you're being paid by your clients to push issues. So I spent 21 years lobbying the legislature as a way to make my living and to stay involved. And then just a couple of years ago, I retired.
So nearly as long as a lobbyist as you were a legislator. So
That's right.
how did you determine which clients you would or would not take as a lobbyist?
I mean, sometimes, issues that I personally would not get involved in is, say, if Catholic Charities came to me and said, we want you to push for right to life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's an issue I would not get involved in.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly, like if you're a criminal defense attorney and you take your clients and you defend their issues.
Mm-hmm.
So unless it's something that affected me morally,
Mm-hmm.
I would get. Our firm was heavily involved in a lot of things. We represented Pepco. We represented the racing industry. We represented the Baltimore Orioles in certain areas.
What's the difference in how you felt about the relationships? So when you're a legislator, you work with other of your colleagues, other legislators, and you try to convince them to support your piece of legislation. When you are a lobbyist, you're working with the same legislators to try to convince them to support a piece of legislation. How did that differ? How did changing from being an elected official to being a lobbyist change the way your relationships functioned and change the way you were perceived in Annapolis, and just how did things change for you in transitioning?
Well, relationships are important.
Mm-hmm.
And our firm was probably the largest lobbying firm in Annapolis, and we work as a team, so I was able to bring other people in. But the question is being able to meet with the legislative leaders one-on-one to convince them to do a certain thing or vote a certain way, or why your client's position was a good one. Doors open for me, and you see that's what's happening a lot in Maryland, and also on the Hill, where you're able to.
Did it ever?
Right. Now, the other interesting on the Hill, one of the keys is to get the staff. In Maryland, it wasn't the staff; it was being able to talk one-on-one with the legislator and deal with them, and not have to go to staff. And on the Hill, the staff does a lot of that.
Did it ever strain your personal relationships to have a meeting with a former colleague based on something that you were paid to advocate for?
No. I mean, I understand if they didn't agree with me, they didn't agree with me. I understood that. But the question is you got to be honest with the person you're dealing with. And as long as they recognize you as being honest, they'll respect your opinions. Otherwise, you can get in trouble.
Okay. So, and then, all right, well, we're nearing the end of the podcast. So I wanted to just ask you to reflect upon your years of service in whatever capacities you've held. Why have you given so much to Montgomery County and to Maryland? Why, or do you feel like you've given very much? I feel like you've given a good portion of your life to public service. Why have you done that? What sacrifices did you make? Why did you feel like it was worthwhile to make those sacrifices? And why was it meaningful for you?
Well, the beauty of the legislature is being able to accomplish something. And I think over I was involved in legislature for 50 years, basically, 24 as a legislator at the time as a lobbyist. But I was able to accomplish a lot. For one, I was able to get millions of dollars to the state of Maryland by changing the way they invested their public funds. I created the Joint Committee on Public Funds.
Now, do you mean pensions?
No, I mean state money in the bank.
Huh.
When I first came in the legislature, the banks never paid any money. The state would keep all its money in the bank, but the bank never paid the state anything for it. They would have 25 in those days. And you got to remember, in the period of time, interest rates went way up to maybe 14, 15%, and they were investing the state money and giving the state the money based on legislation I passed.
Yeah.
The funding for the Chesapeake Bay was legislation that I passed. I mean, I did so many interesting things.
How'd you get the idea to do that?
I think I read a story about
somewhere else
investing public funds. Yeah.
Huh. And then, did you ever think that you were putting the public money at risk?
It really wasn't at risk. The question was, who was earning the money that was sitting in the bank?
Yeah.
The banks were earning the money because they were investing it and keeping the money. They weren't paying the state anything for it.
So you got taxpayers a better return on their tax dollar.
On the money that they had paid into the state.
Yeah.
In those days, sometimes it was $50 million a year.
Wow.
That the state was able to pick up because of that. And that joint committee on the management of public funds is still in existence.
Now, you mentioned that you were also very interested in being supportive of businesses, but obviously, would you construe that as being supportive of businesses?
That was support of the state.
Yeah.
Supporting the business side and homeowners.
How did banks react to that, though?
Well, they pitched in because they wanted to get them. They still wanted to get the state money.
Yeah.
in the banks. But I also was able to do, I get just so many, chairing a committee is important. I want capital money. For the treatment for projects in Montgomery County, I was able to get lots of money into the county because the chairman's key on that stuff. So, say the Treatment and Learning Center, I was able to get them a $2 million grant at one time. Just so many projects in Montgomery County, Strathmore Hall.
So last question, it's a two-part question. Why were you effective at what you did is the first part of that question. Why were you effective? And the second part is, what would you consider to be your legacy?
Well, I think I was effective because I was able to work with my colleagues. I think that's key. We had the largest committee. We had 13 members in the committee, and we had a lot of talent on the committee. And being able to control the way the committee worked and the subcommittees was important, and I enjoyed doing that. The legacy, I think the legacy that I left were some of the things we had talked about, some key legislation that I passed. I don't think there's anybody that's chaired a Senate committee basically as long as I did, and we just had a good working relationship with that and with the governor, and I just think the state. I think I made the state a better place during the 24 years I was there.
So you heard it straight from Senator Lawrence Levitan, who says public service for him was meaningful because he was able to get stuff done. And by bringing tangible benefits and real returns back to the people who sent him to the legislature to represent them, he is able to have a successful and meaningful life. Through action, in service, Lawrence Levitan had a meaningful career. This has been episode 34 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll speak to you next time.